History of a young soul who lost their way in the forest. Rex was already at the tree line when Thomas heard it. He hadn't called him, hadn't seen him go. One moment the dog was at the edge of the yard where he always spent the last hour of daylight, and the next he was gone, a gray shape dissolving into the dark mouth of the forest without a sound, without a look back. Thomas was on his feet before he understood why. In 2 years on this property, Rex had never done that. Not once. He was a dog who waited, who watched, who moved with the deliberate patience of something that understood that most things didn't require urgency. When he moved fast, it meant something was wrong. Thomas grabbed his jacket off the porch rail and ran. He heard it when he hit the tree line. Thin, high, the kind of sound that doesn't travel far before it starts to break apart. But he caught it on the wind, just enough, just once. A child, crying, somewhere inside those trees in the dark in the 31-degree air that had been dropping all afternoon. Rex was already gone. Thomas didn't call his name. He just followed. Before we go any further, what you just heard is the beginning of a story about a 2-year-old girl named Ellie Marsh, a forest that swallowed her whole on an October evening, and a German shepherd who found her in the dark before hypothermia did. A dog who had no training for this, no one asking him to go, and no reason to care beyond the one he'd apparently decided on himself. If you want to know what happened inside those trees, and what it cost Thomas to follow him in, stay right here. And if stories like this one are the reason you found this channel, subscribe. There's a new one every week. 2 years had changed the farm in ways that were mostly visible, only if you knew what it had looked like before. The porch lattice had been replaced. Cedar boards, same wood as the chest Thomas had found in the back bedroom. The rose bush he'd planted at the far left corner, the yellow one, had survived its first winter and come back thicker than he'd expected, which the woman at the garden center had told him was a sign of good rootstock, and which Thomas had chosen to interpret as something slightly more than that. The well he'd never trusted had turned out to be fine after all. He'd had it tested twice just to be sure. The barn still leaned slightly to the east. Some things you learn to accept. There's a version of this story where Thomas Hale, having survived 1 year on a property that turned out to be carrying more history than he'd bargained for, packs his remaining boxes, sells the farm, and moves somewhere uncomplicated. A condo outside Knoxville, maybe, with a ground floor unit and a small balcony where Rex can watch the parking lot. A version where a man who came here looking for quiet finds out the quiet was going to cost him more than he expected, and decides the price is too high. That's not what happened. But it's worth noting that it could have, because the fact that it didn't tells you something about both of them. Thomas had stopped teaching school. He'd started something he hadn't expected. Small at first, almost accidental. After the case had resolved, after the detectives' calls had tapered off and the local paper had run a short piece that he'd asked them not to and they'd run anyway, a woman had found his number and called him. She had a property 2 counties over, she said, that had been in her family for 4 generations. Her grandfather had died without explaining certain things. She thought there might be documents, letters, something. She didn't know where to look or how to look, and the county recorder's office had been politely unhelpful. Thomas had driven over on a Wednesday and spent 4 hours in a cellar that smelled of coal dust and old newspaper, and by the end of it, he'd found what she was looking for, and a few things she hadn't been looking for but needed anyway. He hadn't charged her anything. She'd insisted on paying him. They'd settled on enough to cover his gas and a modest amount for his time, and he'd driven home unsure how to categorize what had just happened. Rex, in the passenger seat, had seemed unconcerned about the categorization problem. By October of the 2nd year, Thomas had done this 11 times. He'd started keeping notes, then files, then a proper system. He wasn't a private investigator. He didn't have a license and wasn't looking for one. He was something harder to name. A man with a particular skill set and a dog with a particular nose and a growing conviction that the past had a way of leaving itself around for whoever was patient enough to find it. He'd found over those 11 cases that the thing people were most often looking for wasn't information. It was permission. Permission to believe what they'd half believed for years. Permission to close a door that had been standing open for decades. Permission to stop carrying something that had never been theirs to carry in the first place. The documents and letters and buried tins were just the physical form that permission took. He thought about that sometimes. About Margaret, whose story had needed someone to find it. About the permission he'd given her niece, who'd cried on the phone, to finally grieve properly. He was still thinking about it on the evening of October 14th, sitting on the back porch with cold coffee, when Rex went still at the edge of the yard. The Marsh family had moved into the county 8 months earlier, into a farmhouse 3 miles north of Thomas's property, separated by a stretch of white pine and birch that nobody had logged in 30 years. Thomas had met them once. David Marsh, a contractor from Portland who'd decided his 2 daughters needed space to grow up in, and his wife Karen, who had the particular exhausted warmth of a woman raising small children in a place where nothing is convenient and the nearest pediatrician is 40 minutes away. Ellie was the younger one, 26 months old at the time. Thomas had seen her exactly once, sitting in the bed of their truck at the hardware store in town, eating a cracker with the focused determination of someone doing important work. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's directness and an expression of general concentration that Thomas had found, in that brief encounter, unexpectedly affecting. He hadn't thought much about them since. That's the arithmetic of distance. You know your neighbors the way you know landmarks. You note them, file them, return to your own business. There isn't anything cold about it. It's just what spread-out living looks like. He found out later, from the detective, from David Marsh himself, from the piece the local paper ran that he was slightly less annoyed about this time, that Ellie had slipped out of the backyard at 4:47 in the afternoon, through a gap in the fence that her father had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. A gap just wide enough for a 2-year-old who decided she wanted to investigate the tree line she'd been looking at from her bedroom window since August. The temperature at 4:47 was 41 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. She was wearing a light quilted jacket, corduroy pants, and 1 boot. The other had come off somewhere in the first 100 yards of forest and hadn't been found until the following morning, sitting upright in a patch of dead leaves like it was patiently waiting for her to come back for it. By the time Karen Marsh looked up from the kitchen sink and registered the particular quality of silence that meant one of her children was somewhere she couldn't account for, 19 minutes had passed. 19 minutes in a forest in October, with the sun behind the ridge and the temperature dropping through the 30s. What happened in the Marsh house between 4:47 and 5:06 is a sequence Thomas pieced together gradually, over multiple conversations, and it follows a pattern that search and rescue coordinators will recognize immediately. The initial check of obvious places, the escalating certainty that something is wrong, the 911 call that feels both urgent and somehow presumptuous, the small voice that says maybe she's just in the yard, maybe you're overreacting, and then the dispatcher's tone that confirms you are not overreacting, and everything else that follows from that. The first call went to 911. The second went to the Hendersons, the nearest neighbors to the north. The third went to the Okafor family, who had teenage sons with ATVs and a willingness to use them. Nobody called Thomas because nobody had his number. Rex didn't need a phone call. Thomas hit the tree line at a run, not the steady, sustainable pace of someone who does this regularly, but the lurching urgency of a man who has just processed, in real time, what he heard and what it means and what needs to happen. His 56-year-old knees registered a formal complaint that he filed away to deal with later. Rex was already 20 yards ahead, threading through the undergrowth with an economy of movement that Thomas, even in his current state, noticed as unusual. No backtracking, no circling, no hesitation at the intersections of deer trails. He moved with the particular purposefulness of something that knows exactly where it's going. Not running, but committed in a way that made running beside him feel right. Let me tell you something about how dogs find people. Because it matters to what happens next and because most people have a version of it in their heads that isn't quite right. Dogs don't track scent the way a person follows footprints. Point to point, step by step. What a dog is doing when it works, a scent trail is something more like reading a landscape of chemical information that exists in 3 dimensions and changes over time. A child walking through a forest deposits scent on everything she touches, breathes near or walks across, skin cells on bark, breath condensation on leaves, foot pressure releasing compounds from the soil. That information doesn't disappear immediately. It disperses. It pools in low areas, gets carried by wind, concentrates where the child spent more time. An experienced nose isn't following a trail. It's reading a map. Dogs have roughly 300 million olfactory receptors. Humans have 6 million. Their brain's smell processing center is proportionally 40 times larger than ours. When Rex moved through that forest without hesitation, he wasn't guessing. He was reading something Thomas was completely blind to. Thomas followed as fast as he could. He had his phone and the flashlight app on it, which gave him a cone of white light that showed him roughly 3 feet of forest floor at a time, and made everything beyond that look more absolutely dark than it probably was. He called Rex's name twice. The dog's ears registered the sound, one brief rotation, but his pace didn't change. The forest was white pine and birch, densely planted, the ground under the needle bed soft and mostly soundless. Within 4 minutes of entering the tree line, Thomas could no longer see the lights of his own house behind him. The temperature in the forest was sharper than in the open field, the kind of cold that gets into the spaces between your collar and your skin, that makes your face feel like a separate problem. He thought about Ellie, 26 months old, one boot, 41 degrees at 4:47 and dropping. He stopped thinking and kept moving. Rex paused once, at a fallen birch that had come down sometime in the last year and left a gap in the canopy. He stood at the edge of the gap with his nose working the air in short, precise inhalations, not searching, but confirming the way you check a compass before you continue. He looked back at Thomas once, which Thomas had learned to read correctly over 2 years of this. Not a request, not uncertainty. An acknowledgement. I see you. Keep up. Then he pushed through a tangle of low-hanging branches and disappeared into the dark. Rex. One ear flicked back, then the branches closed behind him. Thomas went through after him. He smelled the pine resin first, dense and sharp, concentrated in a way that meant he was moving into a pocket of older growth, trees that had been standing long enough to saturate the air around them. The needle bed was deeper here. His feet made less sound. The light on his phone showed him Rex, 6 feet ahead, slowing, not stopping, slowing. The difference between a dog that's lost the trail and a dog that's found what it was looking for and is now being careful about how it approaches. Thomas slowed too. He heard her before he saw her. Not crying anymore. The crying had been the sound he'd heard from the porch, the sound that had carried on the wind for 3/4 of a mile. What he heard now was smaller. A child's breath, uneven and shallow, the kind of breathing that happens when a small body has been working hard at the task of staying warm and is starting to lose that argument. He moved the flashlight. She was at the base of a white pine, one of the old ones, 4 feet across at the base, the roots rising out of the ground in a wide, gnarled circle before disappearing back into the soil. The root mass had created a natural depression, a shallow bowl maybe 2 feet deep, and the curve of it blocked 3 sides from the wind. She was sitting in it with her knees pulled to her chest and her chin tucked down, the quilted jacket pulled as far up as it would go. Rex was lying against her side. His body was curved around hers the way a parenthesis curves around what it's meant to protect. His chin was on her knee. His eyes were open and they moved to Thomas as he stepped into the small clearing, but he didn't lift his head. He had been there long enough that she had stopped shivering. Thomas stood at the edge of that root circle with the flashlight pointed at the ground between them, and he took a breath that took longer than he expected to complete. There are moments in a life that ask you to hold them before you act on them. Not because action isn't needed, but because the thing in front of you deserves to be fully registered before you start altering it. This was one of those moments. Ellie looked up at him with the unnerving directness of a toddler who has not yet learned to perform fear for strangers. She assessed him, the flashlight, the jacket, the face, with the methodical thoroughness of a child who has recently had an adventure and is filing the information away. "Dog," she said. "Yeah," Thomas said. "That's Rex. He's warm." "He is." She looked at Rex. Rex looked at Thomas. Something passed between them that Thomas had no language for and has since stopped trying to find language for. A German Shepherd's resting body temperature runs between 101 and 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Against a 26-month-old who had been sitting on frozen ground for close to an hour in near-freezing temperatures, that differential isn't nothing. Rex hadn't just found her. He'd made a calculation. Stay, maintain contact, hold the position, and he'd executed it with a patience and steadiness that no amount of training can fully explain. Search and rescue dogs are trained to find and alert. They locate the subject, bark to signal their handler, and lead them back to the source. The protocol does not include staying. Staying is not in the training manual because staying means the handler doesn't know where you are. And a handler who doesn't know where their dog is can't help anyone. Rex had never been trained for search and rescue. He didn't have a manual. He'd found a cold, frightened child in the dark and made a different calculation. He'd decided that the child needed him more than the handler needed to know where he was. Thomas called 911. Then he pulled off his jacket. The temperature was 29 degrees by his phone, and wrapped it around Ellie, who accepted this with the particular unflappability of a very young child who has already processed the most alarming parts of this experience and has arrived at a plateau of simple cold fact. Rex shifted to accommodate the jacket but didn't move away from her side. Thomas sat down on the root mass to their right and kept the flashlight on his face so Ellie could see him. And the three of them stayed that way while the dispatcher talked him through it, and the lights of the search party began to appear through the trees to the south. David Marsh reached them 11 minutes later. He was running, and then he wasn't. His legs made that particular failure of muscle that happens when you've been holding your body together around a fear for long enough that when the fear resolves, the structure holding your body together resolves with it. He sat down in the pine needles 6 feet from his daughter, and for 3 seconds, he just looked at her, the way you look at something you were afraid you were never going to see again. Then Ellie said, "Daddy?" And he gathered her up in one motion and held on. Karen arrived 40 seconds later. She was still in her kitchen clothes. She had a flashlight in each hand, and her face had the quality of a person who has been running on pure adrenaline for 53 minutes and is only now starting to understand that it's over. She held her family on the forest floor for a long time. Thomas watched from a few feet back next to Rex, who had stood up when David arrived and was now sitting at Thomas's side with the patient composure of a dog that has completed its work and is waiting to be told what comes next. He didn't seek acknowledgement. He didn't approach the family. He sat with the particular ease of a creature that has done what it came to do and is comfortable with the fact that the transaction is complete. Most of us, if we're being straight about it, do good things with at least one eye on being seen doing them. Not from vanity, exactly, but because acknowledgement is one of the ways we know what we did mattered. Rex had none of that visible need. He'd found a child and kept her warm, and now he was watching her family hold her, and his tail moved once against the ground. Slowly. Once. That was the whole ledger. Karen Marsh looked up at some point and found Thomas standing there, and her expression went through several things quickly before it landed on something that wasn't gratitude exactly, something too raw and unprocessed for that word, and she said, "Thank you." And Thomas said, "It was Rex." And she looked at the dog and said it again. Rex's tail moved. The paramedics reached them 4 minutes after the family. The lead medic was a woman named Torres, who had worked search and rescue calls in Grafton County for 11 years, and who assessed Ellie with the practiced efficiency of someone who has seen this exact situation enough times to know exactly what matters and what doesn't. Ellie's core temperature was 96.2 degrees. Normal is 98.6. At 95, hypothermia becomes clinical. At 93, it becomes dangerous. The forest had been 31 degrees for the last 40 minutes.
She had been sitting in it for 53 minutes.
Torres did the math without saying it aloud. Thomas did it too, standing 6 feet away with Rex at his feet, and the number he arrived at had a simplicity that was difficult to hold without feeling something about it. She told Thomas afterward, while they were waiting for the second ambulance unit, that she'd seen dog-assisted recoveries before. Trained SAR teams. She said this was different. Trained dogs find and alert, she said. They don't stay. Your dog found her and decided that staying was more important than leading you to her. She looked at Rex. Rex looked at the middle distance with the equanimity of someone not interested in being discussed. That's not something you can train, that's judgment. Judgment. We're careful about that word when it comes to animals. It implies a level of deliberate reasoning that sits uncomfortably close to the things we like to believe are uniquely ours. But the research on canine cognition has been moving in an inconvenient direction for years. Inconvenient for the people who prefer a clean line between human and animal intelligence anyway. A 2021 study from the University of Vienna found that dogs demonstrate what researchers call flexible decision-making, the ability to modify behavior based on novel contexts rather than conditioned responses. They don't just do what they've been trained to do. They encounter new situations and they reason about them, imperfectly and in ways we can't fully map, but genuinely. Rex had never been in a situation remotely like this one. He'd encountered it, assessed it, and made a call that no one had trained him to make. Ellie was transported by ambulance. Her parents rode with her. The search party disbanded. The forest went quiet again. Thomas drove home at 9 o'clock with Rex in the passenger seat, which was Rex's preferred arrangement and one Thomas had stopped arguing about 14 months ago. The dog's head was resting on the window frame. His eyes were half closed. He smelled like pine resin and cold air and something Thomas had come to associate specifically with Rex after long effort. A kind of warm, slightly dusty smell that was the dog's own, distinct and familiar. The smell of a thing that belongs where it is. You knew, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Rex's ear moved. One slow rotation acknowledging. Before I heard anything, before I was even paying attention, you already knew. The ear moved again. Rex shifted his chin fractionally on the window frame. His eyes didn't open. Thomas drove the rest of the way in silence that didn't need filling. David Marsh came by the following morning. He appeared at the gate at the end of Thomas's drive at 9:15 with a six-pack of beer and the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and arrived anyway unsure of how to begin. I know it's early, he said, lifting the six-pack.
It is, Thomas said. Come in anyway.
They sat on the back porch for 2 hours. David talked about Ellie, about the particular texture of almost losing something so new to the world, so unfinished, so entirely dependent on the competence of the adults around her, about the gap in the fence, about 3 weeks of meaning to fix it and not fixing it and what that felt like to sit with now. Thomas listened the way he'd learned to listen over 56 years and 11 informal investigations, without the need to resolve it, without the reflex to offer comfort that would make the listening about his own discomfort with someone else's pain. Rex lay between them on the porch boards, working his way methodically through a patch of autumn sunlight that moved across the boards as they talked. At some point, David looked down at the dog and said, "How do you thank something that can't understand what you're thanking it for? It's a real question. It touches something genuine about the nature of gratitude, whether gratitude requires a recipient who can process it, or whether the act of feeling it and expressing it does something necessary for the person feeling it, regardless of whether the message lands. Philosophers have been working on that for centuries without arriving anywhere conclusive. Thomas was a historian, not a philosopher, and he'd found that historians were, on balance, more comfortable with unanswered questions than most. What he said was, "I think he understands more than we give him credit for." David looked at Rex for a long moment. Rex had one eye open, tracking the conversation with the mild interest of someone following a story they've heard parts of before. "Yeah," David said, "I think you're right." Ellie was discharged from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center the following morning. Her core temperature had normalized quickly with warming measures, no frostbite, no lasting effects. The pediatrician used the phrase "within survivable parameters," which her parents found simultaneously reassuring and quietly devastating in the way that near-miss language always is. She asked for Rex 3 times while she was in the hospital. Her mother told her the dog was home resting. Ellie received this information with the particular gravity of a child processing something that matters. "He was warm," she said. "Here's what the research tells us because it's worth knowing. A 2020 longitudinal study in preventive veterinary medicine found that children who interact regularly with dogs show measurably reduced cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, not just during stressful events but in the recovery period afterward. The warmth Ellie felt against Rex wasn't only thermal. There was something happening at the level of her autonomic nervous system, something her 26-month-old brain didn't have language for but her body recognized immediately. Dogs have lived alongside humans for somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years, depending on which archaeological record you trust. That's long enough to have shaped each other, neurologically and otherwise, in ways that are only beginning to be mapped. She came to the farm for the first time 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in November when the first serious frost had turned the field silver, and the rosebush at the corner of the porch had gone dormant and pulled its color back into its roots for the winter. Karen held her hand on the walk from the car, and Ellie submitted to this with the patient tolerance of a child who understood that the hand-holding was for her mother's benefit and was willing to provide it. Rex was on the porch when they arrived. He stood when the truck pulled in, tracked them up the drive with his ears forward, his tail making one slow, deliberate arc. Ellie let go of her mother's hand at the gate. She walked up to Rex with no performance of caution, no tentative hand extended for sniffing, none of the approach an adult uses with an unfamiliar dog. Just the direct purposefulness of a child who has decided that something belongs to her and is going to confirm this. She put both hands in the fur of his neck and pressed her face against his jaw. Rex went completely still. Tail stopped, eyes forward. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Then his tail began again, one long, slow sweep, and he turned his head just enough to rest his chin on the top of her head. A deliberate thing. A placement. Thomas watched from the porch steps and thought about warmth, about what it means for something to stay because it has decided staying matters, about how rarely that happens, how rarely, in a life, someone simply remains present when leaving would be easier. He had bought this farm to be alone. He had arrived here trailing wreckage of a marriage, a career, a self that hadn't fit anymore. He had found under the porch a story that wasn't his, but needed him to carry it for a while. He had found in a forest in the dark a child who needed something warm to lean against. He had found, over 2 years on 60 acres of red clay and cedar trees, that the land had opinions about what it needed from its occupants, and that those opinions were worth taking seriously. He didn't have a word for what any of that was. He'd stopped needing one. Rex didn't get a headline. Nobody issued a press release with his name in it. He found a lost child in a dark forest and kept her warm until help arrived, and then he came home and went to sleep. That's the full accounting. If something in that stayed with you, if you found yourself in Thomas or in Ellie's parents or in the quiet stubbornness of a dog who decided that staying was the only thing that made sense, then you already know what this channel is. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting. One final thing. In October 2025 in Dorchester, New Hampshire, a 2-year-old child went missing in forested terrain in near-freezing temperatures. She was found alive after several hours, located with the help of a dog before the official search party reached her. Search and rescue dog teams in the United States respond to more than 3,000 wilderness search operations every year. The Federal Emergency Management Agency recognizes canine search and rescue as among the most effective tools available for locating missing persons in complex terrain. Dogs can work in darkness, in dense vegetation, and across distances that would require human teams many times longer to cover. In hypothermia cases specifically, where survivable parameters narrow with every additional minute of exposure, that speed differential is not theoretical. A 2019 analysis of search and rescue outcomes in the United States found that subjects located within the first hour had significantly higher survival rates than those found after 3 hours or more, with the gap widening sharply in cold weather environments. For many of the people found alive in those searches, a dog's nose was the variable that made the difference. The names in this story are fictional. The capability and the stakes are not.